They were sure that everything would go the way it always did. They'd chosen a victim, chosen someone they didn't think they could defend, someone they could trample, humiliate, destroy with impunity. They laughed as they handcuffed her, enjoying their power, looking down on her as if her life was worthless. They thought her story would end like hundreds of others, another name on a list of broken destinies, another black man thrown in jail because they decided so. But they didn't know one thing. They didn't know who she was. At the end of the story, leave your opinion below, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. The sun was slowly slipping toward the horizon, painting the expanse of Alabama fields in the scarlet gold tones of the passing day. Brittany Caldwell was feeling tired after a tough trial where she had to testify in a major drug cartel case, but she remained attentive and focused. The black Ford Mustang she was driving was cruising along the nearly deserted highway with no signs of trouble until a police car appeared in her rearview mirror. This car had been following her for about 10 minutes, keeping its distance and obviously not turning on its blinkers or sirens. In such situations, especially on the deserted roads of southern states, it could mean only one thing. The local police had decided to have fun, stopping someone who was not their own to show the guests their superiority and power. This sort of thing happened often, and Brittany knew these tricks well. As an agent of the Drug Enforcement Administration, she had encountered such people regularly and knew exactly how to behave in such circumstances. She kept her speed at exactly 55 miles per hour, not a fraction over the limit carefully indicated by the road signs along the highway. Her breathing was steady, her movements calm, and her face showed no emotion. If the cops were going to play this game, Brittany was going to play it strictly by her own rules, anticipating her opponent's next move. Suddenly, the patrol car came to life, painting the interior of her car with piercing flashes of red and blue. Brittany drove smoothly and carefully to the curb, letting the fine gravel crunch softly under her wheels. The car came to a complete stop, and she turned off the engine, keeping both hands on the steering wheel so that the police officers could see them clearly. She mentally prepared herself for the conversation, running through the options of possible police behavior, and she knew that in such situations the most important thing was calmness and confidence in her actions. Two officers emerged from a patrol car, one tall, slender, with sunglasses worn casually, the other a stocky, middle-aged man with a pronounced belly protruding from beneath his uniform. The tall one approached the driver's door and tapped lightly on the glass with his fingertips, showing a clear desire to demonstrate his superiority. Brittany slowly rolled down the window and calmly looked him straight in the eye, waiting for him to make the first move. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said dryly, not even trying to hide the irony in his voice. "Please show your car papers and driver's license." Brittany calmly pulled the documents out of the glove compartment and held them out to him, watching as he didn't even look at them carefully, continuing to study her face intently. "Are you in a hurry, ma'am? You ignored a stop sign a few miles ago." "Officer, you're wrong." The policeman exchanged a meaningful glance with his partner and smirked, making it clear that her words made no difference to him. He'd obviously expected her to resist, to escalate the conflict further, and he was a little surprised at her calmness. "Step out of the car, please." "On what grounds?" The second officer stepped closer, his hand on the handle of the taser, clearly signaling that disobedience would end badly. He stared at her silently, waiting for the woman to take the hint and come out herself. Brittany realized that there was no point in further argument, so she slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and calmly stepped out of the car, standing on the hard, crunching gravel under her shoes. The two policemen immediately approached, blocking her escape route and watching her with obvious interest. But even surrounded by two men who were sure of their impunity, Brittany felt neither fear nor anxiety. She already realized that these were not just aggressive village cops, but officers who were so sure of their impunity that they were willing to overstep the law. And now they had chosen the wrong person for their game. Brittany decided not to reveal her cards right away, letting them believe in their own strength and control over the situation. After all, the deeper they went, the louder their fall would be. Brittany stood on the gravel roadside, feeling the stares of the two officers, clearly intent on continuing their premeditated game. Dusk was slowly settling in, shrouding the deserted highway in gloomy shadows that seemed to emphasize even more the sense of helplessness of anyone who would be here alone with the corrupt officers. But Brittany was more than just a random driver in a strange neighborhood. She knew these games by heart, calculating their every move in advance and maintaining absolute calm and composure. The tall officer, whose name was Mason Lancaster, walked slowly around her car, ostentatiously peering through the windows, as if trying to find something to justify their obviously far-fetched accusation. The other, Derek Vaughn, was standing right next to her, keeping his hand on the handle of his taser and openly expressing his willingness to use force at the slightest hint of insubordination. Both were clearly used to this scenario and apparently expected no difficulty or surprise from a woman under their complete control on a deserted highway. Lancaster paused at the car door, tapping his fingers lightly on the glass and addressing his partner in a loud voice that held a poorly concealed irony. "Derek, do you think there's anything interesting in there? She's got a car like that, obviously suitable for hauling junk." Vaughn grinned contemptuously, glaring at Brittany as if they had already agreed in advance what they would find in her trunk and were now just playing for publicity, giving the appearance of a legitimate procedure. "I think, Mason, we're about to find out. Something tells me the lady's not as innocent as she's trying to make herself out to be." Brittany met his gaze calmly, not allowing herself even a hint of the anxiety or excitement the officers wanted to see on her face. She knew perfectly well that they had decided to set her up by planting drugs or other illegal substances in her car, and she was already mentally strategizing how to proceed. Her inner voice urged her not to reveal her true identity right away and let them drag her into a trap from which they would not be able to escape without consequences. Without waiting for a reaction, Lancaster opened the trunk of her Ford Mustang, ostentatiously examining the contents, and within seconds he pulled out a sealed plastic bag containing an unknown substance. "Well, look at this, Derek. It turns out we got some serious crime here. Who would have thought, right? You've been so good, ma'am. You almost convinced me of your innocence. But the facts, as they say, are in." Brittany realized that now was the time to reveal the cards, so she spoke calmly, addressing both officers at once in a steady, confident voice. "I am a federal agent for the Drug Enforcement Administration, and my badge is in my wallet. I suggest you check it carefully before you go too far." Vaughn and Lancaster exchanged surprised glances, but confusion lasted only a second, and then the smug smirks returned to their faces. They clearly weren't going to take her words seriously, and continued to act out the scenario in which they considered themselves the protagonists. "Of course, we'll take your word for it. Cuff her, Derek." Vaughn grabbed Brittany's wrists roughly, forcing her to turn her back and forcing her arms down, while snapping the cold metal of the handcuffs. In that instant, she realized that the game had moved to a new level and there was no backing down now. They had chosen the rules of this dirty game, but the end of it, contrary to their confidence, was just around the corner and promised many unpleasant surprises. When the metal door slammed shut behind her with a heavy, unpleasant sound, Brittany slowly looked around the gray concrete walls of the cell, soaked with the mustiness and despair of past detainees. Her handcuffs had already been removed, but the sensation of cold metal still lingered on her wrists, as if reminding her of the injustice she had just faced. Despite the circumstances, fear did not overwhelm her. Instead, a determination was slowly building inside her to prove to these corrupt officers that she had been chosen by them for nothing. In the opposite corner of the cell, a young, dark-skinned man was sitting on a thin, obviously uncomfortable mattress, looking visibly depressed and exhausted, as if he had been here for more than a day. He looked at Brittany curiously, obviously not expecting to see a confident and calm woman who did not fit the typical image of criminal detainee. After a little silence, he hesitantly asked in a low voice, afraid of attracting the attention of the guards outside the cell. "Lancaster and Vaughn stopped you, too, didn't they? I can see by the look on your face. You knew right away what was really going on here." Brittany nodded back at him, calmly walking closer and taking a seat on a hard wooden bench anchored right against the wall and scrutinizing his worried face. "Yes, they decided to play their usual game of planting drugs and blaming those who can't resist them." The boy grinned bitterly, shaking his head slightly, and then took a deep breath, trying to cope with the accumulated emotions, and added softly, as if speaking to himself, "I've been held here for 3 days, no one knows where I am, and no one has even let me make one single phone call. Brittany felt anger rise up inside her at the realization of the scale of the mayhem these men had wrought in a quiet Alabama county. A few minutes later, heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway, and the familiar voices of Officers Vaughn and Lancaster filled the silence of the cold cell, causing the young man to shudder and press himself against the wall. Both officers paused at the bars, looking at Brittany with ill-concealed arrogance, as if deliberately emphasizing their superiority and total impunity, especially for African Americans. Lancaster grinned wryly, leaning leisurely on the bars of the grate, staring at her from head to toe and deliberately pausing before he spoke. "So, lady, are you still convinced that your federal agent badge will somehow get you out of here? Or have you figured out how things work in our county? You are all too used to stopping and arresting innocent black people with impunity, but this time you picked the wrong person for your dirty games." Vaughn snorted contemptuously, glaring at her and her cellmate as if to emphasize their racial identity, and spoke arrogantly, filling every word with outright contempt and the certainty of his absolute impunity. "You know, your type always thinks the laws are written for them, but we have different rules here in Alabama, and you should be used to it by now." At that very moment, however, the hurried footsteps of several men sounded sharply down the corridor, and the dispatcher's voice over the radio caused both officers to turn sharply and tense with surprise. "Sheriff Lancaster, we got agents from the federal government out front demanding the immediate release of Agent Brittany Caldwell." The smile of confidence slowly faded from the faces of both officers, replaced by surprise and fear as Brittany watched in satisfaction as her self-confidence and illusion of power quickly crumbled. The courtroom was filled with deafening whispers of people discussing a case in which a dark-skinned female DEA agent was the victim of obvious racial bias on the part of the local police. The judge, an elderly, gray-haired man, was scrutinizing the papers in front of him, visibly tense from the situation in which he would have to publicly choose between justice and the usual prejudices of this small, deep town. Brittany was in the dock, calm and confident, despite the officer's attempts to portray her as a typical black criminal deserving of punishment. The prosecutor, a young white man with a pale face and poorly concealed anxiety, nervously flipped through the pages of the case, clearly aware that the whole story now looked highly suspicious and could at any moment turn into a high-profile scandal involving racism and police corruption. His voice sounded tense and uncertain as he voiced the charges against Brittany, listing items that Vaughn and Lancaster thought would be convincing to a jury accustomed to trusting white police officers. "Your Honor, the prosecution is charging the defendant Brittany Caldwell with possession and transportation of drugs with intent to distribute and resisting arrest." Brittany rose from her seat, glancing calmly at the judge and speaking in a firm, confident voice that instantly drew the attention of everyone present to her. "Your Honor, before I respond to the charges, I would like to direct the court's attention to the facts proving the racial motivation of the detention and the blatantly illegal actions of the officers." There was absolute silence in the room, everyone present realizing that what was at stake now was not just the fate of one woman, but the systemic racism and impunity of the police, who for decades have been stopping and harassing African Americans. The air in the courtroom thickened as Brittany gestured confidently to the judge, who immediately furrowed his brow as he scrutinized the document. The room filled with muffled murmurs, as many of the locals had not expected that the dark-skinned woman whom the local police had so confidently tried to portray as a criminal was in fact a federal agent investigating drug crimes. The prosecutor, clearly confused and embarrassed by this unexpected turn of events, tried unsuccessfully to maintain a nonchalant expression, nervously adjusting his papers on his desk and avoiding making eye contact with Brittany. The judge looked up from his badge, looked sharply at Officers Vaughn and Lancaster, and his voice sounded hard, without the usual leniency characteristic of cases where the defendants were black citizens charged by the local police. "Officers, do you have anything to say about the evidence presented that the woman you detained is a federal agent whose rights you clearly violated?" Vaughn tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat, and Lancaster's face, usually one of contempt and confidence, was now one of confusion and fear of the consequences of his actions. Brittany sensed that the moment had come now, so, addressing everyone present, she spoke loudly and clearly, emphasizing each word. "These officers are used to detaining and harassing specifically black people with impunity because they are sure that no one will stand up for their rights. But today, this practice ends here and now, and justice will finally be served. The courtroom froze as the U.S. Marshals approached Vaughn and Lancaster, presenting a warrant for their arrest, and Brittany watched with satisfaction as their confidence and illusion of impunity crumbled. Brittany walked slowly out of the courthouse, feeling the stares of the locals watching as, for the first time in their small town, a dark-skinned woman was able to win a landslide victory over a system accustomed to impunity and racial discrimination. Her supervisor, standing near a parked car, watching carefully, nodded respectfully when he saw Brittany, realizing how important today's precedent had become the fight against injustice and systemic racism in law enforcement. He had encountered situations like this many times in his long career, and each time he realized how difficult it was for black agents to prove their case in regions where racial prejudice was a norm. The young man with whom Brittany had spent time in the cell now stood nearby, looking at her with undisguised admiration and gratitude, realizing that if it hadn't been for her intervention, he would surely have been another nameless victim of police brutality, never to be remembered. Their gazes met, and in his eyes, she could clearly read the deep appreciation and pain of knowing that without her status as a federal agent, an ordinary African-American man in Alabama would have little chance protecting his rights. He gave her a slight nod, and there was much more than gratitude in that motion. It was a quiet hope for the change that might now become a reality. Mitchell opened the passenger door of the car, looked at Brittany carefully, and asked calmly, obviously knowing the answer, but wanting to hear the confirmation from her. Do you think after something like this the local police and courts will think twice before going after people again just because of the color of their skin? Brittany smiled sadly, shaking her head slightly, but her voice sounded confident and firm, filled with determination and faith in the fight ahead. No, they won't stop immediately, but they will definitely think twice before they try to humiliate or unfairly condemn a black person again. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you liked the story, please give this video a thumbs up